I was 38 years old, married for 11 years. What I found in her phone destroyed me. At 38, I believed I had mastered the art of reading people. My career as a supply chain manager had taught me to spot inconsistencies, to notice when numbers didn't align, when schedules shifted without explanation. What I never expected was to use those same skills on Isabella, my wife of 11 years, in our modest ranch home just outside Toledo, Ohio. The woman who used to greet me at the door with genuine excitement had become a stranger living in my house, and what I discovered about the depth of human deception would shatter everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the price of underestimating a man's patience. Have you ever lived with someone who started treating you like furniture? That's how it began, so subtly that I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. Isabella used to ask about my day at the distribution center, used to laugh at my stories about impossible delivery deadlines and stubborn warehouse supervisors. But somewhere around month 3 of what I now call the beginning of the end, those conversations evaporated. She'd nod absently when I spoke, her fingers dancing across her phone screen like she was composing poetry for someone else's eyes. The first real crack in my world came on a Tuesday evening in March. I walked into our kitchen to find her practically glowing, radiant in a way I hadn't seen in months. She was texting furiously, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth that used to be reserved for me. When I asked what was making her so happy, she glanced up with startled eyes, like she'd forgotten I existed. Just work stuff, she mumbled, but her cheeks flushed the way they used to when we were dating, and I'd surprise her with flowers. Something felt fundamentally wrong, but I couldn't articulate what. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and sense something's been moved, but you can't pinpoint exactly what? That became my daily existence. Isabella's laugh had changed pitch. Her shower routine had extended by 23 minutes. She'd started wearing perfume on grocery store runs. These details might sound trivial to an outsider, but when you've shared a life with someone for over a decade, you notice when their patterns shift like tectonic plates. The second stage hit me like a freight train 3 weeks later. I'd come home early from work, a rare Thursday afternoon when shipments had arrived ahead of schedule. Isabella's car sat in the driveway, but the house felt empty in a way that made my skin crawl. I called her name and heard muffled laughter from upstairs, followed by her voice saying something I couldn't quite catch. When she appeared at the top of the stairs 15 minutes later, hair slightly disheveled and face flushed, she claimed she'd been on a conference call with her marketing team. But I'd been married to this woman long enough to know the difference between work excitement and the kind of breathlessness that comes from entirely different activities. The way she avoided eye contact, the way she immediately busied herself organizing papers that were already perfectly organized, the way she suggested ordering pizza instead of cooking dinner like she'd been planning all week. Every instinct I'd honed in logistics management was screaming that the numbers weren't adding up. I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Marriage requires trust, doesn't it? But trust became increasingly difficult to maintain when Isabella started working late 3 nights a week, when her phone became an extension of her hand, when she began receiving calls that sent her walking quickly to another room with hushed, urgent whispers. The woman who used to share everything with me, who'd consult me on decisions as small as which coffee to buy, had suddenly developed an entire universe of activities that apparently didn't concern me. The breaking point arrived on a rain-soaked Saturday in April. Isabella had gone to what she claimed was a team-building workshop for her advertising agency, scheduled to run from 9 in the morning until 6 in the evening. I'd offered to drop her off, but she'd insisted on driving herself, claiming she might need to run errands afterward. Around noon, I decided to surprise her with lunch, knowing how these corporate events usually served terrible sandwiches and weak coffee. The address she'd given me led to an empty community center with a "closed for renovations" sign that looked like it had been there for months. I sat in my car for 37 minutes, watching absolutely nothing happen at a building that was clearly uninhabited. My hands were shaking as I drove home, not from anger yet, but from the devastating realization that my wife had looked me in the eye that morning and delivered a lie so elaborate, so carefully constructed, that she must have been practicing it for weeks. The moment I saw that abandoned building, my entire world didn't just crack, it completely disintegrated into 1,000 sharp pieces that cut through every memory, every moment of happiness, every time I defended her when friends joked about married life. The depth of her deception was beyond anything I could have imagined. This wasn't a spontaneous mistake or a moment of weakness. This was calculated, systematic betrayal that had been growing like cancer in my marriage while I'd been obliviously planning anniversary dinners and discussing our future. That night, as Isabella regaled me with fictional details about team-building exercises and professional development sessions, I watched her face with the analytical precision I usually reserved for supply chain audits. She was good, I'll give her that. The lies flowed seamlessly, peppered with just enough mundane details to seem authentic. She even complained about the coffee and mentioned a boring presentation on market demographics. If I hadn't seen that empty building with my own eyes, I might have believed every word. But I had seen it, and that changed everything. I began to understand that for months, possibly longer, I'd been living with someone who viewed me not as a partner, but as an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved with increasingly sophisticated deceptions. The woman sharing my bed, eating meals I prepared, discussing weekend plans and vacation ideas, was simultaneously constructing an elaborate double life that required my complete ignorance to survive. The fourth stage of my awakening was the most soul-crushing of all. Over the following weeks, I started paying attention with forensic intensity. Isabella's stories began to unravel under scrutiny. The colleague she claimed to have lunch with was on vacation, according to social media. The client dinner that kept her out until midnight happened on a night when her company's parking lot sat empty except for security vehicles. The weekend workshop she absolutely had to attend was scheduled for a weekend when her supposed employer had posted about their annual office closure. I felt utterly demolished, emotionally eviscerated by the realization that the person I trusted most in the world had been systematically lying to me with the skill of a professional con artist. Every kiss goodnight had been delivered by someone who was planning to deceive me the next day. Every "I love you" had come from lips that were constructing alibis for activities that would destroy me if I knew the truth. I was heart destroyed, spirit broken, hope obliterated by the sheer scope of her betrayal. But here's what Isabella underestimated about me. I'm a logistics professional. My entire career revolves around planning, documentation, and systematic problem solving. While she was busy constructing lies, I was quietly building a case with the methodical precision of someone who had spent 15 years managing complex supply chains. I began documenting everything, not out of malice, but out of a deep need to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. I installed location tracking on our shared devices under the guise of security updates. I started making copies of financial records, noting unusual expenditures and unexplained cash withdrawals. I documented the discrepancies in her stories, the impossible timelines, the colleagues who didn't exist, and events that never happened. Isabella thought she was managing me, but what she was actually doing was providing me with evidence of deception so comprehensive that it would eventually become impossible to deny. The tracking software revealed the truth I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Isabella's team workshops took place at a hotel 6 miles from our house. Her client dinners happened at the same restaurant every time, always with the same companion whose name appeared in her phone as Michael Harrison. Her errand runs followed predictable patterns to locations that had nothing to do with actual errands and everything to do with clandestine meetings. I knew exactly what needed to be done. This wasn't about confrontation or dramatic revelations. This was about extracting myself from a situation that had become toxic to my soul while ensuring I maintained the upper hand throughout the process. I started moving money into individual accounts, updating insurance beneficiaries, and consulting with an attorney who specialized in cases where one spouse had been systematically deceived. Isabella had no idea that while she was playing house with Michael Harrison, I was methodically dismantling the life she thought she could maintain indefinitely. Every lie she told provided me with more ammunition. Every fake smile and fabricated excuse gave me additional motivation to ensure that when the truth finally surfaced, I would be the one controlling the narrative. The beauty of systematic planning is that it allows you to remain calm while your opponent destroys themselves through their own actions. Isabella continued to lie, cheat, and manipulate, completely unaware that each deception was being documented and cataloged. She thought my quietness meant acceptance, that my lack of confrontation indicated ignorance. What she failed to understand is that sometimes the most devastating response to betrayal isn't anger, it's strategic patience. 3 months after discovering that empty community center, I had compiled enough evidence to prove a pattern of deception so extensive that even Isabella's most creative explanations wouldn't be able to explain it away. I had bank records showing expenditures at hotels during her supposed work events. I had location data proving she was lying about her whereabouts. I had a collection of contradictory stories so obvious that a child could have spotted the inconsistencies. More importantly, I had legally separated our finances, updated all necessary documents, and prepared for a life that didn't include someone who had spent months treating me like an inconvenience to be managed rather than a husband to be cherished. Isabella thought she was living a double life, but what she was actually doing was building the foundation for her own exile from everything we'd created together. Every piece fell into place exactly as I planned. The attorney I'd been consulting for months had prepared all necessary paperwork. The financial arrangements I'd been making were now complete and irreversible. The evidence I'd been gathering was comprehensive enough to eliminate any possibility of denial or negotiation. Isabella had been so focused on maintaining her deceptions that she'd failed to notice I was no longer the passive victim she imagined me to be. On a crisp Saturday morning in October, I implemented the final phase of my response to months of systematic betrayal. Isabella was preparing for another fictional work retreat, packing the same overnight bag she'd used for a previous rendezvous with Michael Harrison. She moved through our bedroom with the casual confidence of someone who believed her lies were still working, humming softly as she folded clothes that would help her continue deceiving me. I waited until she'd finished packing, until she'd applied makeup for a man who wasn't me, until she'd sprayed the perfume I'd bought her for our anniversary, but which was now being worn for someone else's benefit. Then I walked into the bedroom and quietly set a manila folder on the dresser where she couldn't miss it. "Before you leave for your retreat," I said, my voice steady and calm, "you should probably read what's in there." The look on her face when she realized she'd been caught was absolutely priceless. The folder contained copies of everything: bank records, location logs, photographs of her car at the hotel, receipts from restaurants she'd claimed to have never visited. There were also legal documents, prepared by an attorney she didn't know I'd been consulting, outlining the terms of our divorce and the division of assets. Isabella's hands shook as she flipped through pages that documented her deception in excruciating detail. I watched her face transform from confusion to recognition to absolute horror as she realized the scope of what I discovered and how thoroughly I prepared for this moment. The color drained from her cheeks as she understood that this wasn't an accusation or a confrontation. This was the end result of systematic planning by someone she'd severely underestimated. "Grant," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I can explain everything." I shook my head slowly. "You've been explaining for months, Isabella." The problem is that every explanation was a lie. The beauty of thorough preparation is that it eliminates the need for dramatic confrontations or emotional outbursts. I'd spent months planning for this moment, and now that it had arrived, I felt nothing but calm satisfaction. Isabella could cry, plead, or attempt to minimize what she'd done, but the evidence spoke for itself, and the legal machinery was already in motion. Justice had never tasted so sweet. Not because I was hurting someone I'd once loved, but because I was finally free from someone who had been systematically destroying me through deception. The woman who had treated our marriage like an inconvenience, who had lied to my face while planning activities that betrayed everything we'd supposedly built together, was finally facing the consequences of her choices. "You've been planning this," she said, her voice barely audible. "You've been planning what you've been doing for months," I replied. "I just planned better." Perfect, poetic justice had been served. The woman who thought she could manipulate me indefinitely had discovered that patience, planning, and strategic thinking would always triumph over deception and betrayal. Isabella had gambled that she could maintain her double life without consequences, but she'd made one critical error. She'd underestimated the man she was betraying. As I watched her realize that her carefully constructed web of lies had been completely exposed and legally dismantled, I felt completely triumphant, absolutely vindicated by the cosmic balance that was finally being restored. Divine retribution had taken its course, not through anger or spite, but through the methodical application of justice by someone who understood that respect, once lost, can never be recovered. The separation process unfolded with the same systematic precision I'd applied to documenting Isabella's deceptions. Within weeks, she'd moved out of our house and into an apartment across town, taking only the belongings that legally belonged to her individually. The house, which we'd purchased jointly, but which I'd been solely maintaining through my income for the past 3 years, remained mine along with most of our shared assets. Michael Harrison, the man she'd been deceiving me with for months, disappeared from her life the moment our divorce became public knowledge. Apparently, the excitement of an affair loses its appeal when it becomes a public relationship with real consequences. Isabella found herself alone in a way she'd never anticipated, having lost both the husband she'd betrayed and the man she'd betrayed him with. The friends who had once admired our marriage began to understand why I'd become quieter, more reserved over the past year. They'd interpreted my behavior as stress from work, not realizing I'd been systematically discovering that the woman they thought they knew had been living a completely fabricated existence. Their sympathy, when it came, was entirely directed toward me, leaving Isabella to explain her choices to people who had witnessed the aftermath of her deceptions. What struck me most profoundly during those weeks was how quickly a life built on lies can collapse when the truth finally emerges. Isabella had constructed an elaborate fantasy where she could maintain her marriage while pursuing someone else, where she could lie indefinitely without consequences, where she could treat me like a fool without ever being held accountable. Reality, as it turned out, had very different plans. I began to understand that my response to her betrayal had been more effective than any dramatic confrontation could have been. By remaining calm, by planning systematically, and by building an undeniable case against her deceptions, I had eliminated her ability to manipulate the situation or control the narrative. She couldn't claim I was being unreasonable, vindictive, or hasty. Everything I'd done was measured, documented, and legally sound. The most satisfying aspect of the entire process was watching Isabella realize that her assumptions about me had been completely wrong. She believed that my patience meant weakness, that my trust meant ignorance, that my love meant I would tolerate anything. What she discovered instead was that patient people are often the most dangerous when they finally decide to act, because they've had time to plan every detail of their response. Months after the divorce was finalized, I heard through mutual friends that Isabella had tried to reconcile with Michael Harrison, only to discover he was already involved with someone else. The man she'd risked everything for had moved on the moment their relationship required actual commitment rather than exciting secrecy. She'd lost everything for someone who viewed her as replaceable, while destroying a marriage with someone who had genuinely loved her until she made that impossible. The house feels peaceful now in ways I hadn't experienced for over a year before Isabella left. I've redecorated spaces that used to showcase her preferences, returning them to styles that reflect my actual taste rather than compromises made for someone who was secretly planning to leave anyway. The kitchen, where I used to watch her text Michael Harrison while pretending to listen to me talk about my day, has become a place where I cook meals for one and feel completely satisfied with the solitude. I've started dating again, cautiously, but with a much clearer understanding of what genuine interest looks like versus performative affection. The woman I've been seeing for the past 2 months, Catherine, asks questions about my work because she's actually interested in the answers. She doesn't check her phone constantly during dinner, doesn't have mysterious errands that require elaborate explanations, doesn't treat our time together like an inconvenience to be managed around her real priorities. The contrast is striking and educational. Real affection doesn't require lies to sustain it. Genuine relationships don't need to be hidden or explained away. When someone actually wants to be with you, their actions align with their words consistently, predictably, without the kind of creative storytelling that had become Isabella's specialty. Looking back, I realized that the months I spent discovering and documenting Isabella's deceptions were actually months of recovery, though I didn't understand it at the time. Each lie I uncovered, each piece of evidence I gathered, was a step toward emotional freedom from someone who had been systematically destroying my ability to trust my own instincts. By the time I confronted her with the truth, I was already psychologically prepared for life without her. The friends who have heard the full story often ask if I miss being married, if I regret not trying to work things out through counseling or confrontation. The answer is simpler than they expect. You can't fix a relationship with someone who has been systematically lying to you for months while actively betraying you with another person. Trust, once completely broken, doesn't get restored through conversation. It gets replaced by vigilance, and vigilance isn't the foundation of a healthy marriage. What I learned about human nature during those months of discovery continues to inform how I approach relationships, friendships, and even professional interactions. People reveal their true character not through their words, but through their actions when they believe no one is watching. Isabella thought no one was watching, which is why she felt comfortable lying so extensively and so creatively. What she didn't realize was that someone was watching very carefully, documenting everything, and planning accordingly. The most profound lesson from the entire experience isn't about betrayal or revenge, it's about the importance of trusting your instincts and responding strategically rather than emotionally when someone you love proves themselves unworthy of that love. Isabella taught me that sometimes the people closest to us are capable of deceptions so extensive that they fundamentally change who we become in response. I'm grateful for that education, even though the tuition was the end of my marriage. Understanding how deeply someone can betray you while looking you in the eye and claiming to love you is valuable knowledge that will protect me for the rest of my life. Isabella thought she was managing me, but what she actually did was teach me to become unmanageable by anyone who doesn't deserve my trust. Dear friends, I'd love to hear about your experiences with trust and betrayal in the comments below. How do you rebuild your ability to trust after someone has systematically deceived you? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your patience was mistaken for weakness? Your insights and stories help all of us understand these complex dynamics better. And if this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it with others who might benefit from understanding that sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't anger, it's strategic patience combined with uncompromising self-respect.